Woodrow Wilson was a piece of shit, and in my opinion, he is our second worst president behind only Thomas Jefferson, who was the subject of the first installment of this series, Thomas Jefferson and the Problem of Francophiles. Now, Wilson would be born right before the Civil War, and he would grow up in the Confederacy. As an adult and during his presidency, he would actually support the Confederacy and the ideals of slavery, in particular the lost cause narrative. He is our most racist president, I feel. And while he was commander in chief during the First World War, his presidency also saw racist policies against not only blacks in America, but Germans and the German immigrants who had come over in the early to mid 19th century. And it's my belief that these two racist policies are linked, and here's why. German immigrants make up our largest per capita racial group. When the German immigrants came over in the early 19th century, many of them voted for the Republican Party and also opposed slavery. And so, in his mind, in order to subjugate African Americans, he had to remove the Germans. And that's why I believe he sided with France during World War One, continuing the pro-French policies of Thomas Jefferson. Now, in the previous video, I left off with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And so for here, I'm going to start a little bit before that in the 1850s and examining the Second French Empire under its ruler Napoleon III compared to the what would become Imperial Germany under Minister President Otto von Bismarck. And I believe that if you look at the policies of these two countries relative to the United States, we should have sided with Prussia over France. And that's pretty much the main point of this series, The Problem of Francophiles. Napoleon III was, I believe, the grandson of Napoleon I, who's Napoleon Bonaparte, the more famous Napoleon. And during the reign of Napoleon III, he would be involved in conflicts in Crimea against the Russian Empire, the Cochinchina campaign in Vietnam, what's known as French Indochina, three races, none of which are native to the area of French Indochina. He would be involved in the Second Mexican Empire, siding with the Emperor Maximilian. And this was concurrent with the United States Civil War. In addition to that, he sided with England in the Second Opium War against China. And of course, the French had a colonial empire in Africa. These conflicts would manifest about 100 years later in the 20th century, and that would drag America with them, most infamously in Vietnam. French-speaking Belgium also had the Congo Free State, where Leopold II would commit one of the worst genocides of the 19th century. Napoleon III's counterpart, Otto von Bismarck, was engaged in wars within their own borders, such as the Schleswig-Holstein War, the Austro-Prussian War, and then, of course, in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Now, as for the United States, as I said, we were fighting the Civil War. And then after that, we were dealing with the effects of Reconstruction and rebuilding the country. And so, to my knowledge, we don't really have a whole lot of geopolitical interactions with Europe or Africa or Asia. Most of our focus was domestic and sort of in our side of the hemisphere continuing the Monroe Doctrine. So we were much more concerned with things like the Spanish-American War, for instance. And during this period, I do not know of any particular legislation or presidents that made any kind of alliance with either France or Germany. It seems like we were pretty isolated and focused on our own business. For what it's worth, this period was dominated by Republican presidents. Between Lincoln and Wilson, we would only have two Democrat presidents, Grover Cleveland and the aforementioned Woodrow Wilson. But that would change with the 1912 election, which saw Woodrow Wilson defeat the incumbent William Howard Taft and his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, who had started the third party, the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. Now, as a side note, I just want to point out that third parties cannot win presidential elections. So, as far as Wilson's racial policies, one thing that he did was he had a filming of a Ku Klux Klan propaganda movie called Birth of a Nation, which was viewed in the White House. So when you see a bunch of Hollywood actors talk about, the racial history of the United States, that is their legacy. Okay, that is their guilt that they are espousing. And of course, at the end of his 2 terms, we get the Tulsa Race Riot in 1919 or 1920. So again, when we see these big racial riots, they're often caused by Democrats. The key incident that got us into the war was the sinking of the Lusitania, that we were in fact illegally giving weapons and munitions to England. It's my belief that a sovereign nation has the right to defend its borders. And if we were illegally giving weapons to England, then I believe that Germany had the right to defend itself and its borders, its sovereignty. And so I do not believe that Germany was the bad guy in World War I. World War II is a different story. One of the central powers was the Ottoman Empire. And when we start talking about racial atrocities, Turkey really needs to be up in there, especially the Armenian genocide. Now, the Armenian genocide was acknowledged by Teddy Roosevelt as being, quote, the biggest crime of the war. And a lot of Armenian voters in America actually supported Teddy Roosevelt. They voted for him. And I believe that that's why we do not hear about the Armenian genocide quite like we do with the Holocaust. Because when Caucasian Republicans get, genocided, it's not a big deal. But I don't want to get off topic and talk about the Ottoman atrocities of World War I. This series is focusing on our relationship with France. And so I just want to skip over the war and go right to the end with the signing of various treaties, all of which would culminate in World War II. So the first one up is the one that most people know, the Treaty of Versailles. And there's 2 things in there which would go on to impact World War II. One was the punishments placed on Germany, in particular forcing them to accept blame for the war, which I don't understand because, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. Japan was one of the delegates invited to the Treaty of Versailles, and they wanted the phrase racial equality put into that treaty, and it was England and France that said no. And so that led to a huge increase of Japanese nationalism. And much like Turkey, we don't talk about the Japanese atrocities against China during the Second World War. Things like Unit 731 and the rape of Nanjing, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So England convinced Hussein ibn Ali, who was the Sharif of Mecca, to instigate the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In exchange, the Arabs were supposed to get a pan-nationalist state with Hussein ibn Ali as the king of the Arabs. France did not like this, and so France and England, they came up with a secret agreement that they were going to go back on their promise to Hussein. And so these border conflicts are a direct result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But basically this would culminate in World War II, which is the only event in history where Germany is the bad guy compared to France and England. This is the one time, not just in the history of the United States, but in the history of all of Europe, there are 2 events where France is the good guy. The Battle of Tours in the 8th century and World War II. And it's ridiculous that the Germans to this day have to sort of hang their head and apologize. To this day, holding that over the head of the Germans is just ridiculous. And it's only done so that France and England can have a geopolitical and economic leverage over Germany. And while I'm on the subject, I just want to remind everybody that Adolf Hitler was a gay, vegan, socialist art student who was pro-abortion, pro-gun control, believed the science of his day, had forced vaccinations, espoused theories of racial privilege, racial revanchism after World War II. France would invade Vietnam in the Indochina War to regain its colonies in Southeast Asia, and they would also go to war with Algeria. So that's where I'm going to start off the third installment. Well, thank you for watching. I tried to go through that as quickly as I could. The Franco-Prussian War, the two world wars, everything that happened in between. Like I said, you can create an entire channel just based off of those events. So I tried to cover it as best I could and as briefly as I could. So I thank you again for watching. Hopefully you learned something. Maybe you'll go on do some research for yourself. And if I'm wrong with anything, please tell me in the comments, because if I am wrong, I want it to be known that I'm wrong. And, I want to fix it and better myself, but I am pretty sure that I am not. So, with that being said, thank you once again, and I'm out.